great to be here today. Before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge the Melanoan people. Having been in the wheat belt for a long time, I've seen their connection to country here. And I also pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Ms McTiernan, Keith, I'm not sure where you are, all of you, it's great to see you here today and putting time into thinking about soils because they're a really important part of what we do. I'm going to give you 4 points, which is really going to be the outline of my talk, and then I'm going to go into a few more details about them. But before I do, a bit about my background. I'm a fluvial geomorphologist by trade. Fluvial water, geomorphology, earth surface, so how the water affects the earth's surface. I spent a long time in the department working in the catchment hydrology group in salinity research, and then I spent some time in regional management in the department in sort of broader agricultural industry. So I spent a reasonable time getting stuck into areas of land degradation that haven't looked great and trying to work out what can we do about them. So from my role, the first bit is really that it's under the Soil and Land Conservation Act and I've got a role there to enforce the Act. Some parts about it that I'm really excited about are the educate and inform land managers in relation to degradation, but also challenging management practices so that we better conserve our soil resources. The last bit I want to touch on today is social licence, because I think that's becoming a really big part of our future. So what do we know? We know soil is vital for our food production. We know globally we've got an increase in demand for our food, but we also know healthy soils underpin that ability to keep producing food. So they're really critical in that sense. But we also know climate is drying, there's been a lot more pressure on our soils. We know our salinity is still increasing. We know erosion continues. And we also know that we've got a range of subsoil constraints, including acidity and compaction, that are limiting how we use our soils for production. So on one hand, we've got this soil resource that we want to use. On the other hand, we've got all these things that are happening that we're not managing. So what do we want to do about it? Well, a short history lesson. I don't know how much you can see the picture there. It is actually from the US, so I'll say that up front so no one picks me up on that. But back in the 30s, multiple droughts, dust bowls, drove a really strong community interest in conservation. And by 1945 in WA, we actually had Soil and Land Conservation Act proclaimed. And it was a call to action at that time. People recognised that the land was important and that it was worth valuing and it was worth conserving. So the Act itself, just to give you an overview, it's there to conserve the soil and land resource and to mitigate the effects of erosion, salinity, flooding, and more recently added to the Act, eutrophication. It's there to say we need to use the land within its capability. We know degradation reduces that capability, and in some cases it's irreversible. We lose our sand through an erosion event, we don't get it back. It provides for prevention as well as mitigation. And as the Minister's touched on, it creates a commissioner, myself in this case, the Soil and Land Conservation Council, and also land conservation districts and committees. And some of you may have been involved in those currently or in the past, but certainly over the course of our conservation history, they've been the action on the ground that's really helped local landholders actually investigate, understand and develop ways of managing their soil. So they've been a really important part of our conservation picture. So, what about me? There's some specific roles that are put out for me. One is prevention and mitigation of land degradation. To promote, and I like this one, promote, encourage, educate, investigate, survey, disseminate information. A really good way of getting stuck into what's actually happening, but working with land managers so that they also understand what's happening. And need to be able to coordinate policies across government so that we actually get a consistent picture in how we're looking at managing our soil resource. I think that first role, that enforcement of the Act, it's certainly my role to pull people up. If they're stepping over the line, the Commissioner does need to step in there. We need to hold people to account in terms of how they're managing their resources. But I also think the Commissioner needs to be making sure that everyone is aware of their responsibilities under the Act in terms of managing that land resource. But these two are the ones that I get a little bit more excited about, and that's that ability to actually be able to actually look at what's happening or what's not happening, but also challenge industry. Are you thinking about the risks of a certain practice? Have you considered what that might do in the big picture of managing your soil resource and not just necessarily a production outcome? So I thought a good way of perhaps having a bit of a look at that was just to take a little bit of a dive into some of the issues that we know. Let's take salinity, an area I've spent a lot of time in. We haven't done a formal assessment on the extent of salinity since 1998. That's 20 years, it's a big time frame. We know at that time that was around 2.8 million hectares at risk of salinity. That's a big part of the southwest part of the state. What's probably more interesting is that this year and last year, in the stuff that we're in monitoring that's been occurring, we know groundwater tables are still rising. Under Dandaragan Plateau, Arrowsmith, East Benue, Esperance Sandplain, southwest zone of ancient drainage. So how is it that with a drying climate, with production that's increased massively over the last 30 years, we've still got water getting through the landscape? So we've got some really fundamental issues around how we manage our salinity to explore. We are in the process at the moment of reassessing that extent, and it will be really interesting to see after a sort of 20-year period whether we refine that outlook or whether we expand that outlook. Soil acidity doesn't specifically sit under the Act, but it's really important for the whole picture. We know that despite many years of campaigns, and I don't know how many Chris has done, but we've had a long time trying to put out to landholders that their soils are acidifying. We have some methods of managing them, primarily putting lime on. Interesting, last year we put over 688,000 tonnes less lime on our paddies. Now there's probably a bit of a financial driver from the previous year, but we have, if we look at the diagram, nearly 70% of our topsoils and over 50% of our subsoils are below our target 5.5. Now acidity is important because if you have acid soils, your root growth is not as much, your nutrient take-up is not as good, your biomass production is not as good, your water use is not as good, and ultimately your soil cover is not as good. So that whole picture, in terms of understanding the soil and what's happening, makes a big picture in terms of managing erosion, managing some of those bigger effects. Erosion. The map, sorry, it's a little faded here, but you can certainly see the brown bits at any rate. This is the wind erosion risk for autumn this year across the southwest part of the state. And between the low and the high risks, there was over 13 million hectares at risk. It's taken on vegetation cover. So we know if we want to prevent our soils being eroded, we need at least 50% for wind erosion and at least around 70% cover for water erosion. In this autumn, just gone, we actually increased our risk due to a lack of cover by another 5%. So nearly 18% of our soils were at risk of blowing. I put that last dot point up there. 4 mils of topsoil is not much, and maybe a 4% reduction in production is not much. But if it's up at the 20% end, that's a fairly significant impact. But the other consideration is it takes hundreds to thousands of years to make soil. So as you lose it, you don't get it back. So we've really got to be conserving our soil to the greatest extent we can and thinking about how we manage the practices we do to manage that soil resource. And that's this year in the northern wet belt, and probably not a great picture, but I'll put it there because we can manage this, we just need to do it. And lastly, eutrophication. Maybe for wheat belt this is not quite as something that you see quite as much, but certainly for our southwest areas, it's really important. Where we have high rainfall, we have nutrients moving through the soil into our waterways and causing excess nutrients in the water, reducing water quality, and we get algal blooms and eutrophication. So of the nearly 2,500 samples in the last year, in this part of the world, this is sort of through the Peel, the Leisure, Lower Blackwood, Geograph, that sort of part, we saw that nearly 66% of the soils had more phosphorus than they needed for pasture growth. A lot of that phosphorus is then going through that soil into our waterway. So the simple process of actually testing our soils, understanding our soils, and then managing our fertiliser application means that we can also manage our eutrophication, but we can probably also save a fair bit of money. So coming back to soils, it's all about really understanding what's happening in your soil on a year-to-year basis. And I can't go past climate change. Diagram on your left here, 100 years virtually. You can see the last 20 years plus, we've seen an increase in temperature. So this is a variability around the mean, and we can see for those last 20, 30 years we're above mean, we're getting hotter. The one on your right is the rainfall contraction. And we know from the climate work that we're seeing a reduction in rainfall, essentially moving towards those southwest areas and drier climate. So if we want to continue production, we want to continue doing it at levels that we require, but we have drying climate, we're putting a lot more pressure on our soils. We've really got to consider how we manage our soils to maintain them, given this outlook for the future. The last bit I put up is social licence. People want to know where their food comes from. They want to know how it's produced. They want to know that it's being produced in a way that is managing the environment. This is probably the first time in our history where we've had such a broad community interest and broad community value in what we do. So we've actually got to be aware of it, and we've also got to capitalise on it. In the most recent ground cover that came out from GRDC in December, talked about some community research that was looking at community trust in agricultural industries. I wanted to put up a couple of sentences that came out of that. This was the first one. Trust is a vehicle to acceptance and enables an organisation or an industry to be given the benefit of the doubt when things go wrong, and it also provides a licence for innovation and a general freedom to operate. When they were doing that research, the two things that were the most uncertain for people were around the trust in the industry, the two issues that people were most concerned about were how the environment was managed and how the industry responded to those concerns. The next comment that they put on that was that rural industries need to keep an eye on the present, but with a view to the future, and demonstrate that they're the best stewards of Australia's resources by maintaining and building that trust. I think this is the first time we can see everyone in the value chain for agriculture actually having an interest in the environment and interest in our soil. We've got a huge opportunity at this point in time to really drive our industry forward as good soil stewards, as well as a good productive industry. Look, it certainly will be much harder to do than it is to say, but I think that is a challenge for all of us that we actually need to embrace. So look, from my point of view as a Royal Commissioner, I see this opportunity. I see the opportunity is in the intent of the Act to conserve our land and soil resource. I see the opportunity is in those strong environmental drivers that we've got in terms of climate change and resource condition. I think there's opportunity in a maturing industry. I think those social drivers and that greater community perspective is really, really important. And we've got a political environment at the moment that really values what we do in agriculture. So for me, I think it's a really exciting time to be taking on the role of Soil Commissioner. I'm looking forward to being out in the paddock. I'm looking forward to being out with the industry and having really good conversations that challenge, that debate, but ultimately move forward our industry. Thank you very much.